Well, welcome to our last session of the day. My name is Greg Pryor. I have the privilege to look after talent, leadership, and culture for Workday. So I'm a fellow practitioner. I'm a longtime fan and friend of Great Place to Work, and it's exactly for the reason that we just heard Beth before. How amazing to see the power of an inclusive culture enabling Beth's story to empower millions and thousands of people around the world. Beth, that was just amazing. So we're going to close today. I have the privilege to introduce our final panel. I'm going to welcome up Ellen McGirt. Ellen is the senior editor at Fortune magazine. She is an award-winning journalist who covers race, culture, and leadership in a daily column for Fortune called Race Ahead. Her reporting has taken her inside the C-suites and on the campaigns with Barack Obama and across Africa with Bono to study breakthrough philanthropy. So welcome Ellen to the stage. Our next panelist is Corey Anthony. Corey currently serves as the Senior Vice President for Human Resources and the Chief Diversity Officer at AT&T. He has responsibility for identifying and developing leaders, aligning employees with the company's vision and priorities, overseeing business unit HR support, and employee engagement. Let's welcome Corey Anthony. We have the privilege to have Beth join us for the panel. As you've already heard, Beth is the Global Vice Chair of Policy for E&Y. She is a member of the firm's Global Executive Board and has public policy responsibility for the firm's operations in 155 countries. In addition, she's the global sponsor of E&Y's diversity and inclusiveness efforts. Let's hear it again for Beth. Fran Katsoudas plays a major role in Cisco's overall performance, leading organizational strategy, promoting operational effectiveness, and elevating the team's performance through innovative leadership. She serves as the Senior Vice President and Chief People Officer for Cisco. Let's welcome Fran to the stage. And then finally, Nancy Vitali is the Senior Vice President for Human Resources at Genentech. Nancy leads a team of HR professionals across disciplines that are dedicated to creating a great place to work for Genentech by addressing issues of evolving total rewards, ensuring the focus on diversity and inclusion to spur innovation, and working to attract talent in an increasingly competitive market. Let's welcome Nancy to the stage.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction. Thank you for the panel, for all work we did to prepare for this. Thank you to all of you for being here. Michael Bush, I love you so much. Where are you? Thank you to Chinwe and the entire Great Places team for taking such good care of us and for being such an important part of the Fortune family. The best companies to work for is a great list. It's an optimistic list. It's one of the fun things for journalists to really work on, a vision for the future where everything gets to be better. And I know that fact that you're here, I love you all too, in a perfectly acceptable, appropriate HR neutral way. For your I know, yeah. I'm hanging with the big dogs here today. For your demonstrated passion and commitment to making things more inclusive and making the entire world better, which is, I know, a huge heavy lift, and we're going to be talking about that a lot today. So I thought before we dug into the nuts and bolts, this panel has been tasked with providing some real solutions to barriers that we all may be facing, but also some really optimistic ideas about how things really work. I'm going to encourage you to tweet any questions to the hashtag, and I will check halfway through to see if there's any responses coming up to see if I can bring them in. But I thought I'd start with a confession. I have never worked for a great place to work. And it's amazing. How many of you are part of a... I wasn't going to mention this deficit in my resume until I saw my boss, Alan Murray, this morning pretty much ask Tim Ryan at PwC for a job. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah.
But it's fine. I'm sure it's going to be fine. Everything will be fine. But it occurs to me that I better get on board contributing in a more meaningful way to not only my workplace, but making sure that the journalism that we do is contributing to the greater body of knowledge. So let's start with what's changed. One of the things that's really come up often today and in my work studying this is that work is changing faster than people. And in your capacity from wherever you're sitting, as in HR and in talent and in human potential, what has changed for you in whatever element of time that makes sense? And how are you leveraging and thinking about that change as you make decisions? So anybody would like to jump in?
So I'm happy to jump in. I would start by saying that the world of HR has changed pretty significantly. And it's really exciting for us when I think about things like the fact that we're using engineering methodology to really think about the work that we're doing. We think about Agile Development, which basically means that we're moving really fast, we're engaging the business in what we do, we're experimenting, we're trying different things. I think it's a very different time for us. Something that we've played with at Cisco is this concept that at this very moment, I think so many of us are breaking HR in the way that we're working. And we're challenging and we're asking questions that make us better. And I think it's an amazing time to be at in HR. And I think also it's hard because I think we're navigating a very interesting time. And I think it makes us show up at our companies in a very different way, and we're happy to talk about that today.
I'd probably add that my sense is the expectations around data and data analytics have really increased in terms of the expectations of what human resources brings to bear. As we think about just not only the pace of technology, and there seems to be an app solution for just about everything that's out there today, but we've seen a real pressure point and an inflection point a few years ago when we created a people analytics team. And I realize in working in Silicon Valley, we're a little behind the times in that. But in essence, really creating a group of analytics professionals outside of human resources from an expertise perspective, data scientists that really help us delve into both structured data inside the organization, unstructured data outside the organization, to really then bring to bear with our executive team more informed decision making and the people related decisions that we're making.
Yeah, you know, for us at EY, I mean, I'm not in HR, I'm in policy, but it's such an exciting time. What you're describing is because we just have to disrupt ourselves. We can't wait to be disrupted. And so we're very aggressively challenging our hiring practices, who are hiring, going to very non-traditional sources, you know, like athletes, like, you know, STEM, which hasn't been, you know, engineers and technologists, which typically hasn't been our sources. But we even sort of think about it as, I'll call it suits and jeans. So the suits are our traditional, you know, professional services, you know, accountants and tax professionals, et cetera, and the suits. And then the jeans are the technology wizards that you were describing, you know, and we have to almost now pair them up to solve challenges for our clients. So you have the suits and the jeans, and so that's a very different hiring model as well. And the gig economy is causing us to look at the contingent workers. I mean, today we hire about 6% of our workforce are contract workers. In 2025, we think it'll be 30% or more will be contract or contingent in the gig economy. So a tremendous change. And so we're looking at all sorts of non-traditional type hiring and recruiting.
So the only thing I would add to that, Ellen, well, first, before I even go there, I have to say also, I really love Michael Bush. Not that I would ever offer gratuitous compliments in an effort to improve my ranking on the list or anything like that.
Understood.
But I absolutely love Michael Bush.
You mean Denzel?
But what I would add to this, I agree with everything that's been said. What I would add is, and this has been sort of a pleasant development that I believe has happened in HR over the last few years, and that is that HR now, probably more so than it's ever been, is truly viewed as a business partner inside of the business, not just a support team, not just a support group. And so now HR, when we say HR business partners, it really reflects that in every sense of the word, literally embedded into the business, helping drive strategic decisions, not only as it relates to, human capital and how we move and manage our talent, but also all of the implications that that has on the overall strategy of the business, and HR is at the table.
So when you think about that kind of shift, how are you looking at to the future? How are you bringing some of your senior leaders on board, and understanding that you're in the policy area as well, but that's an unusual kind of outreach too. How are you making sure that the people who need to be on board understand your unique value?
Yeah, I will tell you, so one of the things, and we always message this within the HR teams, is as opposed to forcing it, then we have to be able to demonstrate and show how we bring that value. So that means as HR business partners, then you have to know the business. You have to know the business as well as anyone else at that table. And then in my experience, once you're able to evidence that, then the business unit or those operational leaders, when they see that, then you don't have to force yourself, try to force a fit to the table. You get invited because they see the true value prop of having you a part of those conversations.
I mean, we're in the talent business, so our talent leader is, central to our business.
Right.
Always is.
I think it brings up a really good point in that the expectations of leaders are really changing. I think there was a time where we didn't hold leaders accountable to making talent and people, regardless of business, everything. And I think that has shifted. And for all of us as different companies in different industries, there's a reset button that we're hitting with our leaders, because we realize it's through those leaders that we change everything that we're doing.
Yeah. I want to add on to the suits and jeans wonderful image, because every company has them, and sometimes those particular groups are more valued than others. But clearly what you've said is that the future of the business depends on people understanding other functional areas, people understanding how to work with people who are very different from themselves. Fran, I'm going to ask you to kick this off. How are you thinking about managing those kinds of inequities at Cisco that most organizations have to deal with?
There was a body of work that we started about 3 years ago, and what I love about that work is that our employees architected really the experience that they wanted to have, which was incredibly powerful. And from that, we created this manifesto, if you will, and a key part of that was that we realized that our edge comes from our people. And when we say that, we don't mean it comes from our engineers or it comes from sales, it comes from our people. And in doing that, I think it allows us to take a step towards for all. I'll share something that was pretty interesting for us a couple of years ago. We did quite a bit of work around pay parity. It's something that has always been very important to Cisco. And when we were going through that work, the for all led us to say that pay parity actually shouldn't be just for women and underrepresented minorities. It should be for men too. And so I think there's a little bit of a shift for all of us in what for all means. And it's making us really challenge everything that we do, even those things that we do from more of a diversity and inclusion perspective.
Yeah, at the center of our strategy is something we call high-performance teaming, because our people, we serve companies, we serve clients, so we need high-performance teaming. And to your point, this goes back to my message of difference matters and everyone is different. This isn't about women, it's not about, it is about difference, and bringing that diversity of skills, of human experiences, of perspectives. I mean, we are really challenging at a team level the diversity along all kinds of dimensions of our teams, because it makes an enormous difference in what we deliver. We actually studied, there's a lot of diversity research about, a diverse team outperforms a homogeneous team, but our people, of course, don't believe it until we test it on ourselves. So we did a study of 22,000 audit engagements across the world, 22,000, and tested for financial performance and quality performance based on the diversity of the team. And we actually showed that diverse teams, not homogeneous at either, say if we toggled for women, all female or all male, they outperformed, diverse teams outperformed financially and better quality.
I know you've got a big talk on a lot of wisdom to share on teams as well, but Nancy, I wanted to get you in here too at this point because you have such a dual focus at Genentech. You've got the molecule and the patient. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on how you turn that inherent tension into opportunities and make sure that everyone's engaged around the right outcome.
Yeah. Well, we heard a lot this morning, I think, from all the leaders about the importance of clarity of mission and culture. And you heard from our co-founder, Herb Boyer, and CEO, Bill Anderson. Those are two unifying factors because, when you think about our mission of creating breakthrough medicines to really make a difference in the lives of patients, and this three-pronged culture that we have around being science-driven, patient-centered, and people-focused. If you only looked at that science-driven component of our culture to the molecule you're speaking of, then you would automatically assume perhaps that it's the researchers and scientists that are the most valued. But it's those other pillars of the culture that are more of that equalizing factor. And it's not an easy thing. You have to nurture culture. You have to define it. You have to be explicit about it. You have to be willing to evolve it where you see cracks in that foundation. But I think where every employee can see themselves in their work with a clear line of sight to that, at least for us, being patient-centered, bringing the patient in the center of the room and the meetings and the decisions that we make, that really is that equalizing factor. And you saw hints of that this morning, but that really carries the day from how are we inclusive together, even though we know what leads us is that scientific discovery that's happening in the lab. But that's just the first step among many to get these medicines to patients that we serve, which is our end customer.
So can we dig into the nuts and bolts of how Cisco manages teams? Because I know it's been in my years of studying leadership at Cisco, this is the latest, greatest iteration. I'm curious how it's going.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. So where we started from was we went out to our business leaders and we basically asked them, tell us what teams you want to replicate. Tell us those teams that just continue to excel. And so they gave us 100 teams across Cisco. And then we had a control group of 200. And we were pretty astounded because we could see big differences between those best teams and the rest. And that really kicked off an amazing amount of focus for us on teams. So at Cisco, we believe that performance and culture happens on teams. And if we can understand that secret sauce, we can get all teams to be performing at their highest level and feeling connected to one another and to a bigger purpose. And so from that, we identified 3 things. They're not going to shock you. So the first thing was, on my team, my teammates have my back. And that's all about safety and trust, and I think we get that. The second one is, on a day-to-day basis, I'm playing to my strengths. The reason this is so important is you are seen now for who you are, what's different about you, your strengths. And then the third piece is, on my team, we have shared values. And that's all about, we know what winning together looks like. And so now everything that we're doing is through teams, and we're working with our team leaders to ensure that those 3 things are there. And we're about 1.5 years into the journey. What we can see is that when our teams play, and I can talk more about that later, we see a big swing in the overall engagement of the company as well.
So I have a terrific question here. We're starting to get questions from the crowd. Thank you. So what methods enable you to define the link between people practices and performance more effectively? This is from Tessa Hearns. I hope it's okay to say your names. It's too late now. It's out there. I love you, Tessa. The link between people practices and performance. Is that a measurement question? Is that a leadership question?
So I think it's all of the above, right? It's both. That's the one you just said yes to. I know what we have done when you look at our performance management processes and our programs there. So a couple of things. One, you just have to establish the expectations, right? You have to be really clear about that around the expectations from a leadership perspective. And then we actually have, and I think Nancy mentioned this a little earlier when you talk about the tools and processes that we have access to when she was talking about the changes in HR. The platform that we use where we can track that, right? So we can see, we can assess how well the leader is putting into place all of the policies around talent management, leadership, all of the tools that we have there, are they utilizing those? Okay, and then we hold people accountable for that. So that's accountability. So it's setting the expectation, giving people the tools and processes to be able to do it, and then going back and inspecting what you expect, and then hold people accountable for it. And if our leaders are not doing it, then that's another coaching conversation in and of itself, and we hold them accountable for it.
Yeah, but we also look at, and I'm sure we look at team engagement. So that you look at the engagement of that team, because it does drive performance, and the leader of that team, if you've got a team that's not engaged, there's someone accountable.
Yeah. So where do you find resistance in all of this? This is, we're easing into the nuts and bolts here now, but where have you found people unwilling to engage? Where have you had the tough conversations, and how have you gathered support for what it is that you're trying to do?
Yeah, I can tell you one. I'm sorry, go ahead, Nancy.
No, you go.
She's like, hey, you taking all the time? So one of the challenges that we experience often is that leader who asks this question. So you're having this conversation. To Beth's point, we have employee engagement results. We have ENPS, where we serve our employees. You're having a conversation with that leader, and then they turn around and look at you and say, okay, Corey, what do you want? Do you want results, or do you want this? Right? Do you want me to make the team feel good, or do you want the result? Because we are such a results-oriented, driven company. And so we have had, if there's any pushback or struggle, it's been the leaders who don't fully grasp that's not an either or, right? We want both. We have to have both. And we show them, we give them examples of other leaders in the business who are successfully doing both. So it's not an either or. So it's sort of dispelling that whole question, right? You eliminate that from the vocabulary. It's not an either or. You have to do both.
Did you want to jump in?
I would just say, for me, I don't know that I would classify it as resistance per se, but more, how do you negotiate priorities? Because everyone's individual priorities are different. And so going back to, how do you share some of the data? How do you share some of the analytics behind what is being experienced, whether it's a Great Place to Work survey or another engagement survey, or that voice from the employee and the masses? And I think when you present some of that data and you connect it to some of the things you were talking about, Fran, in terms of team performance, related to those who have higher engagement, then I think you can start to open up the dialogue around those priorities. Because that's where I've encountered some of the not resistance per se, but let's negotiate. And if I can get them in the long haul to focus on those areas that are needing focus, then I think that's a win.
But in the domain of advice, can this happen without senior leader buy-in? I mean, we have a wonderful question here about smaller businesses who don't have an HR department. Can this kind of change happen at other levels? What kind of persuasive conversations do us regular folks need to have with the people who now work at PwC to transform our own organizations from within? Is that even a reasonable goal?
So I would tell you, it can happen in pockets without leadership buy-in. It will not be sustained, and you will never be able to scale it across the business. So the short answer is you absolutely have to have leadership buy-in. It will not work without it.
I couldn't agree more. It's funny, Nancy and I were talking about this. You can have a lot of great programs that are cutting edge or exciting, but they become things if they're not tied to a real leadership mandate. And you need to see role models at every level of the company, but especially at the CEO and the C-level, really living the values, really living the expectations that you have. But if you don't have that, you're not going to get there. And for those that are trying to break through, what I would say is start with one. And if you can get one to start to demonstrate some of this, I think there's great momentum that comes from that. And then I think the peer group will start to see, wait a second, there's something really powerful there. But it's the first step.
Beth, you shared a really interesting story in our prep call about bringing in non-traditional talent. And you had mentioned that they were professional athletes. You're hiring former Olympians at a record clip. Could you talk a little bit about what the response to that initiative was and what you're discovering about not just that group, but how we can think about credentialing people differently?
Yeah, and this really does come to sort of challenging the way you look at credentials when you're thinking about hiring. So how we got focused on this was was looking at female athletes in conjunction actually with our sponsorship of the Rio Olympics. And we started exploring the female Olympians, what their challenges were, et cetera, and we realized that they spend their life perfecting their career in sport, and then that career ends all too early at an early age, and they've got to pivot to something, and they're so not prepared to pivot. And of course at EY, we were very focused on getting more women into leadership. That was our motivation. How do you get more women into leadership? And we're talking to these female Olympians and thinking, this is the greatest untapped pool of leadership talent in the world. And they're just routinely hitting the wall when their sport career ends. And so we started to explore, how do we help them pivot? Because they think their future is only as a coach or a broadcaster versus, the world of business. So we started to focus on that. And then we did some research and researched C-suite senior women. So CEOs, CFOs, CIOs, and we found that 94% of women in the C-suite played sports, and over half at a university level. We went, wow, okay. So the athletes have something that it takes to make it all the way to the C-suite, female athletes. So we have started a program to help elite female athletes pivot to success in business. But then importantly, kind of put our money where our mouth is, and we're also hiring elite female athletes to join our business, and male athletes, but we've been uniquely focused on female athletes because they have all the skills any of us in the room would go looking for. Losing is just feedback. They are so resilient. They love to be coached. The harder, the tougher, the better. They learn quickly. They're teamwork. They know how to build teams. They don't care if you like your teammates or not. They will get the best out of them. They know how to get people playing to their strengths. Everything we would look for. So what we realized then, we started looking at our recruiting processes. And you know what? We weren't really recruiting athletes from campus in our normal cycle. Why? Because we required a requisite number of internships. Well, they're playing D1 sports. They're not doing internships. So, I had a softball player come up to me and goes, it took me 3 years to get an interview with you guys because I didn't have the internship. So we've hired, after the Rio Games, we hired 9 female Olympians who were retiring after the Rio Games as interns because, again, they need to pivot. They don't even know what they're good at. They've just been good at their sport. They don't even know what their passions might be in business. So we hired 9 as interns. 7 of them are converting to full-time employment. 1 is a Paralympian, and we're on a mission with this. So it's a really unique opportunity.
That is fascinating. Let's expand on the idea of failure too. Fran in our call, Nancy in our call, we talked about the fact that 9 out of 10 molecules don't make it. So that it's another area where failure is just sort of part of the process. Could you talk a little bit about how you've been able to institutionalize the idea of risk-taking and share that with other parts of the organization? Or is that a challenge?
Yeah, I'd say that's a work in process, actually. I think the researchers and scientists automatically assume that, right? That's the whole point. You're running experiments daily, and you know that some of those molecules are just absolutely going to fail. And through our efforts of calling, all of the input and feedback across the organization and recognizing, we're in the business of making sure that there's safety and quality to every patient who gets one of those vials of medicine. And I think that naturally creates tension in terms of ensuring, there's certain aspects of our business that we cannot zero tolerance for risk, right? But how do we challenge ourselves to think about those other areas where we can take risks, and how do we learn from that scientific method that the researchers are doing and apply that in other areas of the business? And this is some of what we're talking about, is how to do more experimenting, more prototyping, and recognizing what's good about that is failing fast and then moving forward. But you have to be very thoughtful. It's smart risk-taking, and that's the differentiation.
Did you want to jump in on the?
I think you have to give permission to your teams to work that way. We found that at Cisco as well. It was about 3 years ago. We did focus groups, and we realized that people didn't know if there were going to be repercussions if they failed, and was that acceptable behavior. And so what we basically did through our people deal, which is the aspiration that we have at Cisco of who we want to be, we basically said that innovation is a big part of who we are. We're going to innovate everywhere. We're going to create that environment for our teams. But on the flip side, we want our leaders and our employees to be bold and to take risk. Within HR, we've done a few fun things. We've had 2 hackathons. We call them breakathons. And what I've realized about those in retrospect is that we were giving the organization permission to just break things. And we asked the team, like, what are those little big things that just drive you crazy that you want to change? And we had about 70% of the organization play, and we learned a lot from their ideas and some of the trends of what they came forward with. But what it really was this was going to be a time where we were going to experiment, we were going to try different things, and then we were going to focus on what that means for our development as well.
I've got a terrific question from the crowd here on institutional racism and bias, which will be a sort of good segue to some of the other topics that we're going to tackle later on. How are you navigating and using your platforms to fight institutional bias, considering that you're responsible for the areas that you're responsible, and for bias that comes up in the world, like the proposed Muslim ban? How are you solving the major problems that the entire world is facing?
If we answer this one really well, Michael, do we move up on that? No, so that, obviously, we've talked about this one a little earlier today. That's a huge lift for all of us. One of the things we've done is sort of accepting this reality that it's going to be very difficult as a company for me to know what everyone's biases are, right? Mm-hmm. And that's very difficult. What I can focus on is what your behaviors are.
Okay.
I can focus on that. That's something that's tangible. I can see it. I know exactly what you're doing, so I can address that. And so our focus has been sort of twofold. One is giving, and you heard Randall talk about this a little earlier today, giving the business permission to have conversations around those biases, giving the permission to the individual that, hey, it's okay if you share that bias, right? Which has been a two-way street for us. I had this conversation with a group of employees last week. While I'm encouraging folks to share what, let's talk about those biases, acknowledge them, right? Because you'll never be able to overcome them if you don't become self-aware first and acknowledge that you have them. The other side of that coin, though, is those of us, especially those of us that are in the protected groups or so-called minority groups, you have to be willing to allow that person to have a conversation about their bias and not be so quick to label them with something that ends in ist. Okay. Right? So if a person is having a conversation with me and saying, Corey, you know what, they're being honest, right? They're being vulnerable, and they're sharing with me with some biases they have about black people, then when I hear it, even if it's something that I don't like, or I think, man, that's crazy as hell, but I have to stop short of saying, hey, that person is a racist, right? Because there's a very good chance they may not be. They're just sharing what their bias is. So it's a two-way street. We have to be willing to listen and start that open dialogue. But the other part of that is, focusing on the behavior. Because at least I accepted a long time ago, I'm not going to be able to change people's hearts. Right? If you're the person that for the last 35 years you've grown up in the business and you're 55 years old now and you believe, hey, all black people are lazy and they're not as capable of doing intellectual work as other folks, it's very difficult for me to change your mind. But man, I can watch your behavior. I can change that. And if you're not meeting the expectations at AT&T, as I said a little earlier, sometimes to change people, you have to change people. Get rid of them.
That's right.
This is a tough love crowd.
But I think that's why it's so important to in these moments to say it and say it and say it again. Who are we? What do we stand for? And if that's not what you stand for, then get off the ship. Yeah. You can self-select into this culture, but this is the culture. This is what we stand for.
Ellen, the last part of that question with regard to the rhetoric around Muslims in the country, and I was reminded of the power of the individual person just asking, how are you, and being sensitive to that. We had a whole host of folks this morning talking about race relations last year and having to lean into that discussion, and both of you are alluding to just having the conversation. But I was at an event recently, and one of our employees came up to me and said, you know, one of your team just asked how I was doing with all of what they were reading in the papers and everything else. She says, I'm Muslim. And just having that question asked, how are you doing? And what can I do to help support you? Made all the difference. And tears started streaming down her face. And it's the power. Those individual one-on-one interactions are incredibly powerful. And I think we have to have leaders and peers, team members, just checking in with folks and asking, how are you doing and what can I do to support you?
And also I think it's celebrating unusual things. We had a situation with a Syrian refugee in Germany where, so I think people may have biases even, among the about the refugee population. And we had a manager who understood our values, heard a Syrian refugee was being interviewed on a German situation, and the person said, I want to work for EY. And so this manager ran up the flagpole in Germany, and we hired the Syrian refugee.
Really?
Because he was a very well-qualified accountant who had left Syria. But I mean, he's totally well qualified to work with us, and celebrating that, and we've now created a whole Syrian refugee program, working with other companies in Germany to get companies to hire these Syrian refugees, and it just helped to break that bias people had that somehow they were different, and not qualified professionals that just were in a very bad situation.
Let's talk about women in leadership and the pipeline of talent and women in executive leadership, because that is a trajectory that is not changing, even though there are more female CEOs than there were 50 years ago. The chart is really astonishingly flat. Can we explore together a little bit why you think that is and what steps you've taken to improve the leadership success of women in your organizations?
Sometimes it's the most simple things that we have to look at. As I travel around the globe, something that I hear all of the time is that in many cases, women are looking for role models. And they need to see multiple role models because we're all very different. And our differences will appeal to women. I also have to say that I believe a lot of men serve as amazing role models as well, but that's something so simple that I know is meaningful. At Cisco, both our board and our executive leadership team have 42% women, and that's something that we're very, very proud of, and we're working very hard to really pull that into the entire organization, but we know that that's a starting point that has created momentum for us. Our CEO likes to say that so many companies have been at this for so long, and so we know that we're all trying, but we're not breaking through. And so what that means is we have to be able to do different things. And I think some of the analytics that we have today at least guide us at Cisco around what investments are truly leading to promotion velocity or retention. And at Cisco, when we see that, we double down on those things because they work. And there's things that sound good and we don't see the impact of that, and we just have to stop and let that go as well.
Is there anything around feedback or employee reviews or high potential pools that you've seen that's working or not working? Anything that's not working is just as useful to know about as things that are working, by the way.
I'll hit the high potential pools one. And I would say Genentech today looks very different than it did a decade ago, and it took us a decade to achieve the kind of gender diversity that we see, which is really 50-50 all the way up through the director ranks, 40% female in the officer ranks, and 3 of our 7 C-suite are women. But that doesn't happen overnight, and I think one of the challenges that many companies face is, they're looking for the quick fix, or what are the 1 or 2 things that are just going to springboard us into seeing gender diversity and parity. And I will tell you, for us, it was fortitude, it was taking the long view, and it was just sticking to those actions, one at a time. On the high potential pool question, we had a succession management practice that we still have today, where those senior director women who are at the cusp of making it to officer, every senior director woman is put on a list, and we require the leader to defend why is that individual not on an officer succession plan. And each person is in the hot seat. It's really putting the pressure point on asking the question, well, why not, versus justifying or rationalizing this is the absolute best candidate. And I think that has opened up some discussion and dialogue, and that's one of many different tactics. But I think this is where companies lose that fortitude. You've really got to take the long view. You have to create that dissatisfaction, but then stick to those actions.
I see, for us, we do a lot of stuff, but I see three things that from where I sit actually are making a difference. One, I think, Nancy, you just alluded to, the succession planning. I mean, when our chairman and CEO became chairman and CEO, he was under tremendous pressure. All of our women were really pressuring him to set quotas, like set a percentage of the women that are going to be on in leadership and hit it. And he just wouldn't do it. He said, it's not what I believe in. It's not the right answer. And he instituted this robust succession planning process across all the leadership positions across the world. And it's now in its like fifth year. It's so serious because what we found in that, there's big diverse slates. But what we found were slate sitters, to your point. You got women on the slates, but they never seem to get the position. So every leader is responsible for what career experiences are we giving the people on that list so that they will be ready. So they're identified as either they're ready if the leader gets hit by a bus today, or they're ready midterm, or they're ready long-term, and what experiences are we getting? And we really now are managing it. That helps. The second thing we're doing is what we call promote to pipeline. So in other words, if we have a group of senior managers ready to be promoted to partner, we have 5 rated women, at a certain percentage of our senior managers as 5 rated women, that percentage ought to be getting promoted. And if that's 10% and only 8% seem to get promoted, we've got a problem, and that gets called out. So we just say you've always got to promote to pipeline. So I think those two things work. The third thing very quickly is we just train all of our leaders around inclusive leadership. And that sounds kind of trite, but what I've seen happen is we give them the space to think about their intentionality. Mm-hmm. Who are they really promoting? Who are they really sponsoring? Who do they spend time with? And when they have time to reflect, oftentimes their biases really start to pop out, and I think it's having a difference.
Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, a few things we've done, like what you've heard in terms of the succession planning. What we've done at AT&T is a really, really heavy emphasis on the pipeline. Mm-hmm. And so we're very intentional about identifying the women in our business who we know have the potential to be leaders. And then we have a very structured program in terms of getting them the development and the exposure that they will need. We pair each one of those ladies that we identify. We pair them with an officer in the business that's a male and a female. From a mentoring perspective and exposure perspective, it's called Lift and Connect. So we have structured programs that we're trying to drive the awareness of the talent and the development of the talent. What I would tell you, though, there's a couple other things that we do I think are very, very important for any of that to work. Because let's be honest with you, there's a lot of HR professionals out in the audience. That is nothing new, right? We've had these types of programs for a very long time. There's a couple other things I think that we're doing that will be very impactful. One is changing the environment, right? And I'll give you one example of that, and that's a lot of things, but I'll give you one example where I think will be powerful. And we talked about this a little earlier. One of the notions, one of the comments you'll often hear when we start having conversations about female talent is, and we start talking about men and women in the workplace, and I've been guilty of saying this at times. We'll say, hey, women are, they think differently, they are wired differently. Raise your hand if you've ever heard that in your workplace, right? Women are wired differently. So one of the things I've been doing is purposely stopping the conversation, interjecting some way. No, women are not wired differently. When a baby comes out of that womb, whether it's a male or a female, there's nothing innately different about them two that would make one a more successful leader in this business than the other. There's no difference. Now, women, I'm not naive. Well, at least about this, I'm not naive. Women may be socialized over time, and so by the time they land at AT&T, right? They've absorbed all of these social constructs that they may view and see and think differently about things. But the reason why I'm saying no, I want to allow that conversation to happen is because all that does is gives us as men a way to rationalize why we are treating women differently,
Right.
why we are assessing and evaluating women differently. So the language is very important. So when I talk about environment, that's just one example. So we're trying to, you have to change that environment, take that excuse away. It's the same thing we do with our sales teams when we train them, right? When you're a new salesperson and you join AT&T, one of the first things you're going to learn is when you're dealing with a customer, you're trying to make a sale, one of the first lessons, right? You remove all of the reasons why they can say no. That's one of the first things any successful salesperson learns is you remove all of the reasons why you should say no. But we got to have that same approach when we're talking about female leadership, right? You have to take out all the reasons. And then the other thing that's very, very helpful, and this was taught to me probably about 5 years ago. Matter of fact, she's sitting here in the audience. One of our HR leaders, Kathleen Larkin, we were having this conversation around talent. And she described it this way, and we've been using it ever since, is you also have to be willing to take risk. Mm-hmm. You have to, we talked about it a little earlier, you have to be willing to take risk. And the way she characterized it, which is a great way to look at it, is we start putting our jobs into two big categories. One is what we call hit the ground running, meaning it is a role that, look, I can't take too much risk here. It's so critical to the business. Maybe it's, time sensitive, market sensitive, where the person who lands in this role, I don't have the luxury for them to learn on the job, right? They have to hit the ground running.
Ready now.
And then the other category is what we call up the curve. So this is a role that, okay, I may have the luxury of a month or two to let this person, learn, fill out, maybe some of the things that they don't know yet, skill sets that they don't have, they can develop those on the job. That is very, very helpful because the jobs that you put, in the up the curve category, those you can take a lot more risk.
Right.
Right? You can take a lot more risk, and so we'll use those opportunities to say, okay, we have this, this female leader in the business, it's Coretta. It's not Corey, it's Coretta. She's really, really good. She's really talented. We know she has a lot of potential, but in terms of the skill sets that we've deemed required for this role, maybe we're only able to check 7 or 8 out of 10, but it's an up the curve job. So I'm going to take the risk. We're going to move on this now, and then she'll be able to get those other 2 while she's in the role.
So, Brent, I want to get you into this because this seems like it's right up your alley with your teams and how you're thinking about strengths. Clifton Johnson wants to know if competencies, or if you think about them in terms of competencies and holding people accountable around strengths competencies. But this up the curve thing seems like a really interesting mindset to give people growth and stretch opportunities.
Yeah, it absolutely is. So I don't think this will surprise you, but when we look at our best teams, we see inclusion. And so this is why for us at Cisco, we are really focused on the teams, because when you have a leader focused on someone's strengths, they're getting to know what is unique about each person, and that means that they're also starting to understand how they need to show up to every member of the team as well. A couple of weeks ago, we had a meeting, and one of our leaders basically said, if you are not really curious about what's different about every member of your team and how you show up to them, right, you shouldn't be in a leadership role. Right. And I absolutely believe that's the case. And so we are looking at strengths. There's a very interesting intersection between strengths and skills and capabilities. And that's where we're playing at Cisco. And so we're looking at the strengths as those things that really make you unique and differentiated, how you like to work, what you're best at. And then we look at what are the skills and the capabilities that are important in your role. And to this conversation around up the curve, something that we're focused on at the moment, it's really good to understand the skills and the capabilities that you have. But as you look at how work is changing, then what are the skills and capabilities you need, and how do we really draw a map to that? And so for us, we talk about that as part of our talent cloud and how we prepare for the gig economy. But it's something simple that I think all of us need to be looking at.
There's a great article in Harvard Business Review called, I think it's called Let Your Workers Rebel, that talks about that point. I just highly recommend it. It talks about constructive nonconformity, get people playing to their strengths. But how do you, when you said, we try not to let women think they're wired different, or let our men think women are wired differently. It's such a fine line, though, of trying to, I think in today's world where we really need to empower our people, we really need them to have a little constructive nonconformity rather than conformity that everybody has to do everything the same and think the same. And it's just such a fine line that's difficult, because you want constructive nonconformity today to have teams that are innovative and playing to their strengths.
We only have a couple of minutes left, so I wanted to end on a philosophical note, the sort of a follow-up of where we started. That today, in ways that often surprise me, companies, corporations, businesses, and organizations are looked upon for a kind of moral and spiritual leadership in ways that we haven't seen them before. A stabilizing force in the world, responding to crazy people and events, living their value. I don't mean anybody in particular. Speaking their values that used to only be within your walls of your campuses, and applying that to communities. And the bias work that you're doing actually is transforming an entire nation if everybody does it together. I mean, that's of course the big vision of For All, that we're all doing the work together to see each other for our greatest potential. Could you talk a little bit, just really briefly, on how you see that playing out and why you think it matters?
We just think it so matters, because you're talking about purpose of the organization. And so for us, our purpose is building a better working world. And how do we translate building a better working world for our people? In this exact environment today, income inequality is such an enormous problem, and we are trying to lean in heavily to what role can we play in inclusive growth and inclusive capitalism, and how do we try to deliver the services that we deliver and yet address the greatest needs? I'll just give you an example. So in our hiring and our trying to hire non-traditional people, we have started this neurodiversity program where we are actually, if you look at the spectrum of autism, 80% of people on that spectrum of autism are unemployed. Well, they have really unique math skills and pattern recognition skills, and very applicable to our business. So we started a neurodiversity pilot program to try to work with those on the spectrum of autism. And we've actually found success in that. And so that's creating jobs for unemployed. It is addressing, an aspect of, it's just an example of addressing the income inequality program and inclusive growth. But boy, does that bring our purpose to life for our people.
I would say, I think to your question, Ellen, I think the role of the corporation, and we were having this discussion at our executive committee just a couple months ago, the elevation of expectation of employees, and I'm sure many folks in this audience are feeling it. The pressure point used to be on the family unit as that stabilizing force, and then it moved to like the religious institution, and it feels like the expectations today are now on the corporation and the employer to fill that void.
Yes.
And so when things in the external environment are happening, there is a high bar in terms of the company or corporation response to that. And I think that's something we're having to really lean into, and it's a work in process for us. We have a lot of meaning in what we do. You've gathered that from even the discussion that we were having this morning. We're trying to really fight disease, and so we're keeping the patient at the center of everything that we do. And yet, it doesn't feel like that's good enough for the masses of our employees when other events are happening. And I think we're having to lean into this and to think more broadly about what we stand for, why we stand for it, and how we provide that stabilizing force for employees so that they can do their best work each and every day. I think it's expanding our role as employers.
I would say we went out to our employees and we asked them, what does a great day at Cisco look like? And I'm not surprised that the way that they answered that question is that a great day is when we're benefiting our community. And so that's something that's always been incredibly important for us. On an annual basis, we train about 1 million students a year to help them have a path into technology and to really give them, hopefully, the start to an amazing career in all industries from a technology perspective. So that has always been a part of who we are. I think the last 5 or 6 months have been a really interesting test for us. And I think what it's forcing us to do, and I referred to our CEO recently as the Chief Healing Officer, it's forced us to be that place where we can listen and be inclusive of all thoughts. When the immigration order came out, I found that my team was playing a very different role. And what we tried to do is start with some basic education that could ground us, and then be that place and create that platform as a company where we could have conversation. But what you see in that is that we're incredibly polarized at the moment as a country. And so I think, for us, looking at how we benefit everyone and then look at how we create this environment where we can heal and we can have this greater sense of purpose is definitely where we're focused.
So just a couple of things. I know we're pressed on time.
You
You
got
guys
the last
heard
word.
from Randall, right, our CEO. I think he did an excellent job. But our mission at AT&T starts with connect people with their world, right? It goes on. That's a very intimate proposition. And so I think we at AT&T, we realized that, look, you can't do that if it doesn't start within the business. And we also recognize that the walls, the lines between personal and work now are so blurred that you can't ignore what's happening outside the walls of AT&T, right? It's going to be inside AT&T. If you have 275,000 people, whatever is happening in the world is happening inside of our business. So we figured out, look, for us to be able to execute on that mission, the first part of that mission is a very intimate proposition. Then you have to do that inside of the business with our employees. And you guys heard from Randall how we're doing that.
Yeah. We're out of time. Please join me in thanking the panel.